Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Johnston, and I am a teacher of Modern Studies and Politics at Earlston High School in the Scottish Borders. Today, my session is going to be focusing on adopting a self-regulated learning approach with senior phase classes. The main learning intention for today's session is focusing on how can I encourage self-regulated learning within the senior phase classroom. The main success criteria is looking at how to develop a knowledge and understanding of what self-regulated learning actually is, to consider some of the challenges in implementing a self-regulated learning approach, challenges which I have experienced myself when adopting such an approach and do continue to experience as well, so I really want to emphasise that in this presentation as well. And also consider the role of the teacher in supporting and encouraging self-regulated learning through different pedagogies. The key words being there supporting and encouraging. The self there does not imply learners completely doing this learning completely by themselves. Self-regulated learning, the key starting of the process is very much the supportive and encouraging role of the teacher on how to carry out such a learning process. So I have started off with a definition of what self-regulated learning means. Now I have put a reference slide at the end of this PowerPoint. I've referred to the work of Zimmerman here, who has done a lot of work on self-regulated learning. So if you are wanting to read a little bit more, I'd encourage you to look at his work. So his definition of self-regulated learning is metacognitive, motivational and behavioural processes that are personally initiated to acquire knowledge and skill, such as goal setting, planning and learning strategies, self-reinforcement, self-recording and self-instruction. Now I appreciate that that is a very long definition, so I have underlined some of the key aspects that I want to break down a little bit more in terms of what they mean. So the first part is metacognitive or metacognition, which I'm sure a lot of you have used that word before, is really encouraging the learners to develop an awareness of thinking about their learning, thinking about how they learn and how best they learn. The second part is this idea of personally initiated. This idea that there's a key level of responsibility put onto the individual learner when it comes to self-regulated learning, that they have to be initiating those goals and being very clear about where they wish to be come the end of the year, come the final exam. And acquire knowledge and skill, I think, really is useful in terms of what the purposes of a self-regulated learning approach are. And obviously, if adopting them with senior phase classes, it's really going to be tying into improving their attainment as the year goes on as well. There's nothing to say that you could not adopt a self-regulated learning approach in the BGE, but this presentation is very much going to focus on using it with your senior phase classes. And goal setting, of course, is just one but many tools that a self-regulated learning approach can adopt. It's this idea that self-regulated learning is very aspirational. It's about helping the learners get to where they want to be in a little bit more of an independent fashion, but still, again, as I mentioned at the start, with that supporting and encouraging role of yourself as the classroom teacher. Now, I've wanted to bring in some curriculum links here. So when the Curriculum for Excellence was first brought in, obviously there was quite a few CFE briefings that were written at the time. One of the main ones that really ties in with self-regulated learning is this progression from the broad general education to the senior phase. This document really ties out some of the skills and attributes that learners have to develop as they transition into the senior phase. And I've put there in bold some of the ones that I think really tie in with self-regulated learning. So not only being an independent learner, but this idea of showing self-reliance and self-management, being able to acknowledge themselves where they need to improve, and taking up that management themselves of carrying out that extra revision or doing those extra questions to help them reach those goals. I appreciate straight away some people are probably thinking, I'm not sure that all my learners would be capable of being so self-reliant and managing themselves so much, and that is something I'm going to come back to in the challenges section, how self-regulated learning might look very different for individual learners. And the key part there is obviously being able to self-reflect on what one has learned and what one still has to learn is really, really important, especially in terms of identifying knowledge gaps for the final exam. The second bullet point there tying into the CFE briefing, is this idea of staff adopted approaches to ensure that learners are leaders in their own learning. And I think that really brings in the teacher's role in this process in terms of modelling the practice of how to become more self-regulated, how to set goals, how to acknowledge what helps to get marks and doesn't help to get marks. So it's very much a process that involves both teacher and student in terms of adopting a more self-regulated learning approach. So in terms of another curricular link, I've also brought in the SQA course specifications. Now, I have obviously brought in my own subjects in terms of modern studies and politics, but I'd really encourage you to go away after this presentation and have a look at your own course specifications for your own subject-specific areas. Consider the language. Is the language very much got more of a leading role from the teacher? Or is it encouraging a lot more self-regulated learning in terms of putting in more of an onus onto the students? So in terms of National 5 Modern Studies course specification, what I find quite interesting about this one was the real emphasis on with guidance and mostly familiar context, really highlighting, for many, unless they've done National 3 perhaps or 4 prior, that National 5 might be their first time engaging with senior phase level study, and that it perhaps requires that little bit more heavy guidance from the teacher and contexts that are a little bit more familiar to support that first transition in the senior phase. And then when we push it up to higher politics, so I'm not doing higher modern studies this year, I'm teaching higher politics, so that's why I've shared this specific course specification. You can see already the movement from the mostly familiar context to more complex ones, so really requiring a lot more reflection in terms of the understanding of the content. And again, the level of metacognitive skills there in terms of analysing, evaluating and synthesising. But the key part that really stood out to me in terms of encouraging the more self-regulated learning is the emphasis on learners' planning. So that really implements that they have to have a little bit more involvement in terms of the feed forward of their own learning. And this becomes even more nuanced when you get to advanced higher level in terms of the bottom bullet point there of using active and open-ended learning activities really shows the more open-ended nature in terms of the students being able to design their own learning activities a little bit more, and it gives us specific examples within the course specifications such as presentation tasks. So almost the level of responsibility in terms of the students actually creating learning resources for one another in terms of the course, with the key emphasis there being on for research, that research is the main tool for doing that. So I think it's really clear within the course specifications themselves that the level of metacognitive and independent thinking skills really becomes much more self-regulated as we go through the different levels of the course specifications. And again, as I emphasise, have a look at your own subject areas and see if that sort of language and the tiering of it in terms of the more self-regulated come advanced higher, whether that's coming across within your own subject areas. Continuing with the course specifications, there's a little section that mentions teachers and lecturers should. So almost actually giving specific suggestions of what you can do as a teacher in order to encourage that more self-regulated learning. And again, it uses the words encourage and support. So putting bold there, effective feedback is really, really important in terms of learners specifically knowing how they need to improve. Now, I'm not going to go into feedback in much detail today except from a sort of whole class feedback approach, because I do know that there was another Pedagogy Pioneer presentation last week focusing on feedback, so that might be one to go and have a look at if you want to get a little bit more on that. But really this idea of the teacher encouraging the learner to set their own learning objectives rather than the teacher setting it for them. Being able to ask them to assess the extent of their existing knowledge, so can they identify the gaps in their learning that they need to spend a little bit more revision time on. And this idea of the teacher using higher order questioning, where they're encouraging learners to think a little bit more for themselves, again encouraging a more self-regulated learning approach. And again, I've taken this from Zimmerman's article here. Self-regulated learning is not leaving learners to learn alone. The teacher role is key, and I think that's really, really important. The word self might be slightly misleading, But basically, without that guiding role from the teacher at the start of the process and check-in points throughout the year, learners won't be crystal clear about how they need to improve and how they need to move forward with their learning. So I've provided a little bit of a scale here from self-regulated learning all the way to what's called more self-directed learning. Now, self-directed learning is the far extreme in terms of that independent approach, because basically in a self-directed learning approach, the student's pretty much responsible for creating their own tasks and creating their own goals from it. Now, that might be quite appropriate for advanced higher when it comes to things like dissertations, where the learners have to create their own title, they have to create their own chapters, carry out their own research with check-in points with the teacher to keep them on track. However, for a lot of pupils, it's the more self-regulated learning that's going to be more applicable, especially moving later into National 5 throughout the year later on, and in higher level in particular. It's this idea that the task might, in most cases, not all, be designed by the teacher, and this idea that the learning objective has to be independently accomplished or perhaps independently set. Now, again, you're probably sitting there thinking, I have some learners that I'm not sure that they would be able to independently set their own objectives, and that's absolutely fine, and I'll talk about that again a little bit more later on, that it's a tapered and tiered process in terms of how self-regulated learners can be, where they're sitting along this scale. For some learners, it might be as simple as trying to engage with learning objectives that are perhaps a bit more led and set by the teacher, and it's basically this idea that you're taking a self-regulated learning approach, and that across your class, individual learners are going to be engaging with that at a different level. Some might be very far down the line and almost getting pushed to the point of being self-directed, but other learners might require a little bit more support. So I'm now going to give you 3 minutes to go to the following YouTube link here to watch a summary clip that basically summarises what self-regulated learning means and recap some of the key points that have been mentioned so far, and then we will continue with the presentation. So hopefully that clip has helped to summarise some of the key elements of self-regulated learning that have been mentioned in the presentation so far, and maybe a little bit more of a simplified video clip there. So moving on. So you just might want to have a little bit of a thinking time now, a little bit of a discussion point. Feel free to put anything in the chat that maybe comes to mind, or if you've got a notepad beside you, you might want to just write down some key points that you think apply to your subject-specific area. So thinking about what we've spoken about self-regulated learning so far, what do you feel are some of the main benefits and challenges of taking a self-regulated learning approach with your senior phase classes? So I'm just going to give you about 3 minutes just now to have a little bit of a think, a little bit of a note down. Feel free to pop in the chat what you think are some of the main benefits and challenges of taking such an approach to self-regulated learning with your senior phase classes. So hopefully some of the challenges that you have considered perhaps are ones that I have now brought up on this next slide of the presentation. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of thinking time to think how this might benefit in your classroom and what some of the challenges might be. So some of the challenges that I had reflected upon were the impact of being away from the classroom for a long time due to lockdown. Now, the onus on obviously working from home and working a bit more independently at home might have really suited some learners and naturally have made them a little bit more self-regulated than they had been prior to lockdown. However, some learners really miss the benefit of that face-to-face interaction of the classroom teacher being in front of you. And almost that might make that transition to becoming a little bit more self-regulated and more independent that little bit more difficult due to that almost that catch-up time of having missed that one-to-one teacher interaction within the classroom. Another really important key consideration is that some students might require a little bit more scaffolding with their learning, perhaps due to specific additional support needs. Now, hopefully what I've highlighted so far is that a self-regulated learning approach can look very different for different learners. And one of the strategies I'm going to go on to talk about is the importance of modelling from the teacher as part of the self-regulated approach, and it might just be that those with more specific additional support needs require that little bit more of that modelling approach. Another key element is the motivation levels that self-regulated learning requires. I'm sure it's something that a lot of us has experienced, some learners really just wanting that spoon-fed information in terms of what do I need to do, what does a good answer look like in order to pass that final exam. And that motivation control that's required of learning that little bit more independently is something that some learners can struggle with. Another one that to me is probably one of the main challenges is the time constraints of having to make sure that all the content is taught in time for the exam. Now, taking a more self-regulated learning approach, the modelling element that it requires from the teacher in terms of modelling how to develop targets, providing model paragraphs, a lot of that takes lesson time. Now, some of it is intrinsic to what you would already do in your senior phase lessons anyway, but some of it perhaps requires a little bit more extra time. And again, that can be quite difficult to manage when trying to teach the content of the exam in time for the final exam itself. So just these challenges are important to bear in mind, but obviously the self-regulated learning approach can be really beneficial for learners. It's just about getting that management of these challenges and the benefits. So what I'm going to move on to talk about now is some of the sort of techniques that I've used in the classroom in order to encourage more self-regulated learning. Some of them are things that probably people are already using, but it's about trying to make sure that you're getting a broad brushstroke of these different approaches across different lessons so that self-regulated learning approach is coming across, whereby it's not just one specific tool, but it's a multitude of different tactics coming together within the classroom strategies. So the first one I'm going to talk about, strategy 1, is teacher modelling of best practice. So this really important role of the supporting and encouraging role of the teacher, and perhaps again this strategy suiting the more scaffolding that perhaps some learners might require. Now, I provided a source there, Dignith and Butner. They talk about how younger learners who are less experienced may require more specific teacher instruction of different self-regulated learning strategies. Now, I think that really ties in with the National 5 Modern Studies course specification that I was talking about earlier when it spoke about guidance and that little bit more support, and really just emphasising that modelling is a key way of achieving that. That learners really need to be clear on the initial success criteria so that they can be successful in that final exam, but so they also have that success criteria to be able to more self-reflect against in the future. And a key way of achieving that often is having a model answer, a model paragraph that's showing them exactly how to pick up the marks. So bearing that in mind, a key way that I really utilise model paragraphs is through using suggested writing frames. Now, I'm sure you all have different writing frames appropriate to your own subjects, but here are just some that I've used in Modern Studies and Politics. So the P-chain structure is something that we have to use in National 5 Modern Studies. I know that the P-chain is used in a lot of other subjects, and the main difference in Modern Studies is that we give our example last. Now, a good thing about acronyms is they help to sort of provide a clear structure for the students in terms of how to go about answering the questions. But you can see there that I've put after the point explain example what those specific sections should be trying to achieve. So with the point, it's about naming a particular event or action which is relevant to the question. The explain is describing the details about your point, so making sure it's relating back to the point, and then giving a real-life example to support your explanation. Now, I would always initially accompany this with a model paragraph to give that little bit extra scaffolding, but as the year goes on, the model paragraphs can slowly disappear because students become more familiar with the basic principles of using that P-chain writing structure, and they're able to then independently reapply these writing frames to new topics. So having some sort of writing frame which gives that initial modelling that can then encourage future self-regulation and independence for new topics is a really useful tool. Some students might require those model paragraphs consistently throughout the year, and that's absolutely fine, but it's really thinking about critically the learners in your classroom, how much support each individual learner requires. At the higher level, we use something called the pale reel structure to support our essay writing paragraphs. Essentially, it's this point rebuttal idea, this for, against argument, and having, again, the acronym makes it crystal clear what each component of the paragraph should include. If you see there the link section, which is the analysis, there's little sentence starters as well. And really, again, showing how this writing frame could be applied to different essay topics. Again, the same principle applies of including a model paragraph alongside this and slowly reducing that support as the year goes on to encourage that more self-regulated learning. So these are writing frames that people are maybe using already in their subjects, or maybe have different ones they're using, but that actually does come into this self-regulated learning approach. The second key strategy, which builds upon the use of modelling, is whole class feedback PowerPoints. Now, this would usually be after a major essay or an assessment. I would create a whole class feedback PowerPoint, which would include examples of best practice and areas for development that have been common across the whole class. Now, the examples of best practice would actually include real life examples from pupils' work in the class, which obviously then in turn gives them a confidence boost. The areas for development would be reworded examples that I've created in my own words, but they still demonstrate the common areas for improvement across the class. Now, you're probably thinking straight away here about workload concerns. I would suggest that perhaps you start off by creating these whole class feedback PowerPoints for every couple of topics. The good thing about them though is that they can be reusable for future years. They can be retweaked to suit the class in front of you. However, often the common areas of improvement are quite similar across different years. So again, they shouldn't involve too much editing, and once you've got that resource, you've got it for the future. So on the next two slides, I've drawn out two specific slides that I'd used in a specific feedback PowerPoint that I created for my higher politics class to show you this idea of demonstrating to the pupils these common areas for feedback and the examples of best practice to show to them. So the first slide here is an example slide. So I basically gave the class a slide about examples and what the common areas for improvement were from this particular essay, which was about ideologies on examples. And actually it was quite straightforward for this one because there was only one common area for improvement across the whole class, where the pupils needed to be clear when they were given a specific policy, who that policy belonged to in the sense of who created that policy. And then I provided a model example from a specific student's piece of work where they'd named Margaret Thatcher as the person who had created the policy. So quite a straightforward feedback slide there. A second one, which is a little bit more detailed, is getting them to think about their analysis and whether an analysis was specifically relating back to the previous example they had given. Now, I gave an example of how not to do that in terms of the analysis there not specifically relating back to the example of Scottish independence specifically. Again, this wasn't from a specific pupil's piece of work, but was based on common mistakes across the class. I then gave an example of best practice, which was from a specific pupil's piece of work, but again without naming them, and I've highlighted in bold where the best practice is by adding in that sentence about such as preventing Scottish independence. What I would then get them to do is think about, does this need to feature in my targets? Is my analysis directly relating back to my example given them? So it's almost getting them to think about which of these mistakes or common areas for improvement apply to me and what do I need to focus my target specifically on. This then links on to the third strategy of setting those targets and applying them within future work. And the key way that I've been doing that is through the use of prompt questions, which feature at the end of that common areas for improvement PowerPoint to help them with formulating targets. And I also then have tried this strategy of getting them to highlight specifically within their work where they think they have applied their targets. So first of all, At the end of the common areas for feedback PowerPoint for across the whole class, when I've given different examples of good practice in areas for development, I would have one final slide with prompt questions where the students have to think about which areas for development are most appropriate to them. So for instance, some prompt questions I have were, is my explanation explaining what key terms mean? And I give an example there such as federalism. Are my examples specific enough? The last one there, does my introduction set out what I will argue? And it's getting them to reflect with that little bit of encouragement from the teacher, which of these things are applicable within my work that I need to focus on in the future. Okay, now my encouragement would be some learners might have to focus on a lot of these. I think it has to be kept manageable so that motivation remains. So I always suggest to focus on perhaps a maximum of 2 to keep the targets manageable and achievable. Which then links into this next slide of using SMART targets. It's all in well having these prompt questions to get them thinking about what they need to focus on, but how do they then formulate that into actual targets? Now, I'm sure a lot of you have probably used SMART targets within your own school. It's something that we've actually included within our whole school learning logs, which we're now using as our main reporting system for senior phase pupils. And so it's something that they should be using across their subjects, and then by using it within higher politics, I'm just feeding into that whole school approach of using SMART targets. So for anyone that hasn't used SMART targets before, it's this idea that the target must be specific. It must say exactly what the student is going to do. It must be measurable, so be clear how often they need to do this. It has to be realistic. Are they actually going to be able to achieve it? And it also must be timely. How often or how long is it that they're going to complete it? And again, it's this idea of providing a little bit of modelling so that the students have a sense of what their targets could be. So at this specific SMART target examples here was something that I included in my prelim feedback PowerPoint, where I gave them 2 specific examples of what targets could be to help them go away and create their own targets. Again, I checked those targets for them to help them make sure that their targets were achievable for them. So for instance, the first one I've got there is I aim to revise theories of socialism by creating mind map revision notes during study leave. So it's very clear what they're focusing on, when they're doing it, and how they're specifically going to do that by creating the mind map notes. The second example there, I aim to improve my evaluation in the 20-mark data question by completing more past paper questions at home and in class fortnightly. The key emphasis there being on fortnightly, so they know how often they're going to do it. So again, it's continuing this theme of teacher modelling on how to do the SMART targets, but the more self-regulated learning aspect in terms of them creating those targets completely independently by themselves. The final aspect of the target making process is getting them to actually go away and apply those targets in their next specific piece of work. And what I've been getting the students to do for that is to get them to actually highlight in their work, whether it's using physical highlighters if their essay's handwritten, or if they like to type their essays, actually changing the font colour, to show to me where they think they have applied their target. So the first one here, the pupil target was, I must aim to use more specific examples such as specific committees in my next scrutiny essay. And the person is highlighted here in red where they've applied that target by including a specific Senate committee example involving George Galloway and Saddam Hussein. And upon reflection, yes, they have specifically applied their target. And this is an example of them being able to reflect upon their work and apply their target accordingly. I've included a second example of where a student thinks they've actually managed to go away and apply their target successfully, but they haven't actually specifically managed to do that. So this person's target was, I aim to be as detailed as possible when giving examples in my next power essay. Now, the example that they've actually given about the democratic system in the UK, including the passage of bills, it's too vague. A more specific example would have been specifying a specific bill that's been passed through Parliament. So really what I'm wanting to emphasise is that the self-regulated learning process It's a learning process. Not everyone is going to get everything right first time. It's about that gradual build-up of target application, that gradual build-up of identifying areas for development. They might not manage to successfully apply those targets first time. In that particular example, 2 instance, that would be where that extra support from myself as the teacher comes in by re-talking through that example with them and thinking about where they could look for more specific examples within their notes. So almost giving that little bit of guidance and signposting. What I've wanted to end on a little bit with some pupil voice to show how this self-regulated learning can look different for every individual pupil, and what some find beneficial and what others find beneficial very much differs, and that some learners actually still require a little bit more of a teacher-led approach, and some actually quite enjoyed going away off and applying their targets a little bit more independently. So the bits that I've put in bold were the bits that I thought were most useful. So this person here has put, I'm confident in my own judgment, however I still build my self-formulated goals on the opinions of the teacher. So almost this idea that they're still regarding the expert opinion of the teacher as the guiding principle. This person down here has put, I can see what I've done wrong in previous essays and I can make my own targets from that. So almost this person here is able to self-reflect on previous mistakes and acknowledge new targets based upon that. This person put here, which I found really useful, was, yes, and highlighting of targets helps because then you know you've implemented your targets. Highlighting also helps as it's specific. So it's that actually physically being able to highlight helps the pupils to specifically see where they have applied those targets. Again, acknowledging that they might not always have managed to have done that first time round. Another pupil has put, I can make my own targets, but I believe a teacher gives more achievable target. So almost this sense that perhaps some students might struggle with the SMART targets because they almost make them too difficult for themselves. And there's this idea that they think that the teacher's targets are more achievable. Finally, here we've got, yes, by getting a model paragraph done, it helps me base my own future paragraphs off of it and helps me understand what a good paragraph looks like. So that idea of the scaffolding and the clear demonstration of the success criteria, using those writing frames and those model paragraphs, helps the pupils moving forward creating their own paragraphs. So hopefully what I've emphasised in this presentation is that self-regulated learning is going to look very different for each individual pupil in your classroom, and that by using these 3 different strategies of model paragraphs, common area for improvement feedback PowerPoints, and having the tailored approach to target setting with the modelling of how to set the SMART targets, and then giving that little bit more independence by getting them to go away and highlight where they've applied their targets in their work, it creates that self-regulated learning approach, where there's a multitude of things on offer to the students and they use the things that they feel benefit them most in their learning, and we've then got that scaled approach from a more self-regulated to a more self-directed approach to learning. My final slide is just providing some of the research links, particularly those bottom 2 there are really useful in terms of a little bit of theory about self-directed and self-regulated learning. If you do have any questions, then please do not hesitate to ask me, but I hope that I've helped to provide a little bit more reassurance on how to try and adopt a self-regulated learning approach. As I've said, some of those challenges I'm still encountering and overcoming with each individual class, but it's about trying to encourage learners to become that little bit more independent and self-regulated to support them within that final exam. Thank you for listening, and if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to ask.